Hi. So today we are going to start learning about natural selection. And this is a two-part video series. And so this is part one. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the idea and the process of natural selection was figured out by this really famous guy that you probably have heard of, and his name is Charles Darwin. So this is really a story about Charles Darwin. Okay, so the title of our notes today is going to be The Story About Charles Darwin. Okay, so okay, so Charles Darwin is basically the person who came up with an explanation of how evolution can occur. So he was able to explain how evolution can happen. Okay. And so I want to give you a term, and that is evolution. And what evolution means is that populations change over a long period of time. So evolution means a change in a population um, over a long period of time. Okay, so that's the definition. Um, so I want to add a line here. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to have to back up a little bit first. Um, And so I'm going to back up to a long, long time ago. We had um, some early philosophers who would think about how things are. So I'm going to start with Aristotle and Plato. And they were the first ones who wrote down, something about how all the animals that we can see are perfect in their form and never change. Okay, so a long, long time ago, Aristotle and Plato um, stated that animals were perfect and never change. Okay. And so at the time, this made sense to everybody because you would see an animal and you wouldn't see any change happening. So this was total common sense. But then in the mid 1700s, scientists then discovered some fossils, and they would see old fossils of organisms that lived long ago that look similar to organisms that were existing during the time, but no longer existed. So, from the fossils, they had some evidence that animals actually did change over time. So, I'm going to say in the mid 1700s, fossils were discovered. Okay, this was evidence that organisms did change. Okay, because the fossils showed organisms that, whoops, sorry, evidence. Oh my goodness. Um, Sorry about that. Okay, so evidence that organisms did change because the fossils would show a different organism than what we would see now. Okay, so then now that is accepted that organisms, so I'm going to put some bullet points here. So there's that, then we have this happening. And so now we have some evidence that organisms do in fact change over time. So then we needed to think of how that happens. And so in the 1800s, a scientist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck um, he came up with this idea that animals change over time, but the method that he came up with and how that actually happens was a little bit incorrect. Okay, so he said that animals change over time, which is correct. However, I'm going to say, but his method of this happening was incorrect. Okay. And this is what he said. He said that an organism during their lifetime would acquire some new, more advantageous trait. So let's say, for example, in your lifetime, you trained and you trained and you trained, you became faster and faster as a runner. And that gave you an advantage against, you know, predators that were chasing you. So the faster you got, the more advantageous it would be for you to escape some predator. So all that training you did during your life gave you this new trait, and then your children would get that new trait that you got during your lifetime. So this is what he said, which is incorrect actually. So he said that when an organism acquires a new trait during its lifetime, that new trait would be passed down to its offspring. Okay? And the example that he used was a giraffe. So he noticed the giraffes had these really long necks. And so he was trying to come up with a hypothesis on how these giraffes got such long necks, you know? And so what he said was that a parent giraffe would stretch out its neck just a little bit more than normal, and it would actually grow a little bit more because it was purposely stretching it. And then that extra, like 1 inch, would then be passed down to the child. Then the child would grow up, and then it would also stretch just a little bit more and would add an extra inch. And that extra inch would then pass down to the child. And then over time, it got longer and longer and longer. And so, again, this makes sense because how else could you explain that, how the necks got longer and longer over time? And so, his example was a giraffe's neck. He said that a parent giraffe would stretch out its neck and gain a couple inches. That would be passed to the offspring. Okay, and so for a long time, this is well accepted because people were like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, how else would a neck get longer and longer? Um, However, this is not the case. This would be like if you were to go to the gym every day for years and get all beefed up and your muscles are all huge. And then that would mean that because you did that, you got those big muscles that your children, when you had a baby, your baby would be born with those muscles already, which is not what happens. Okay. So let me start with Darwin now. So he was born in 1809. Okay, so now I'm going to move into Charles Darwin's story. Okay, Charles Darwin changes Lamarck's theory, and he also agrees that animals change over time, but then he came up with how this actually happens, which was more accurate, which is the theory that we now have evidence to support. Okay, so I'm going to start a new story, and this is Charles Darwin's story. Darwin life. Okay, so we're going to say Charles Darwin's life. Whoops, sorry. Okay, let me underline this. Okay, so Charles Darwin, he was born in 1809. And the day he was born was actually the same day and year as Abraham Lincoln. So on that day, Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin were both born, and they both made these huge changes in the world. Okay, so as a child, Charles Darwin um, loved science. So as a child, he loves science and observes nature. Okay, so he loves to be outside. He loves to see how things are working. He takes lots of notes. Every time he has a good idea, he writes it down. He's really good about taking notes his whole life. Um, and so Charles Darwin's dad was a physician, so he was a doctor. So Charles's dad is a physician. Okay. And like most parents, they like to tell you what you're going to be when you grow up. And so Charles' dad is a physician. He's like, it's good enough for me. It's good enough for you. I want you to be a doctor also. And so Charles' dad forces him to go to medical school, which he does do. And so Charles' dad is a physician and pushes Charles into medical school, into going to medical school and becoming a physician. Okay. And Charles does it because he's a good son and he wants to please his dad and he likes science anyway. So it's fine. However, he becomes a doctor and he hates it. He hates his job so much. And the reason he hates it is because while he was doing surgeries, at the time, there was no anesthesia invented yet. So they wouldn't put people to sleep. And if you had a surgery, you would be wide awake and you would feel all that pain and you would be screaming and it would be torture. And so poor Charles Darwin, um, he hated it. And he couldn't stand torturing people. So he told his dad, he's like, Dad, I can't do this. It's hard on my psychological well-being and I can't hurt people anymore. So he quits. So he quits because there was no anesthesia for surgery. Oh, T. Okay, still misspelling that. Okay, let's see here. How do you spell this? Anesthesia. Oh, TH. Okay. No anesthesia for the surgeries. And he just could not stand people, crying and screaming. So he quits. So then what he does next is he goes back to graduate school and he goes to the University of Cambridge and he is studying botany, which is the study of plants. So he goes back to graduate school at the Cambridge University to study plants. Okay, plants and animals. Okay, but his professor was a botany professor, which is mostly plants. And then he does this for a little while, and he's very young still. He's in his early 20s. And then an opportunity comes up where his professor is like, hey, Charles, there's this voyage that's about to take place on this ship. And the ship is called the HMS Beagle. So HMS Beagle is a name of ship um, that will take a worldwide voyage. Okay, and this is happening in 1831. Okay, and so his professor comes up to him and says, you should do this. You should go see the world, see how plants and animals are in other places, and study the natural world. So he, in a way, was a naturalist. And so he did. He went on this voyage and they spent an extra long time on these islands called the Galapagos Islands, which are, let me write this down. So they spent years at the Galapagos Islands. And I'm going to show you a picture of a map. Okay, and so here is a map of South America. And so the Galapagos Islands are located right here, okay, west of South America. And then I'm going to show you a zoomed in picture of this. Okay, and so here is a zoomed in picture of the Galapagos Islands. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of different islands. Okay, there's like many islands, and each one is isolated and separated. And so during this time, while he was going from one island to another, he was noticing that the animals would be similar on each island, but they had these differences. So, for example, the finches on each island had a different shaped beak, but they were finches. So they were obviously related to each other, but the beaks had changed on the different islands according to what type of food that finch was had available to them. So, for example, if it was a cactus fruit, then the beak would be really skinny. If it was a really hard seed, then the beak would be really large to break open those big seeds. So, by going to these different isolated environments, he could see that animals would adjust to those environments. In addition to that, he found a lot of fossils of old organisms that no longer existed. And for example, he found fossils of marine organisms like shells, like seashells, on the top of mountains. And then from that, he could see that time had passed a long time ago because he found seashells on the top of mountains. So at some point, that was at one time underwater, but now is the top of a mountain. So he could see that time had passed for a long time. Okay, so let me write some of this stuff down. Okay, so Darwin observed observed um, the animals had some differences between the different islands. Okay, and then he also found some fossils from the sea on mountaintops, okay, which told him that a lot of time had passed, okay? And so all that time passing allowed these changes to take place, and it was a very slow process. Okay, so based on these observations, he came up with his theory of natural selection. Okay, so based on his observations, he came up with his theory of natural selection. Okay. Um, And so he wrote it all down. He had hundreds of journals that he had all these examples written in. And he goes back home and he's got this great idea about natural selection, but he doesn't want to share it with the world because, and it's still like this, where if you are a scientist and you kind of go against the popular theory, you get judged and ridiculed. And it's still true for today. If you come out and say something crazy like, aliens are shaping animals, people be like, no, you're an idiot. And so he was worried about coming out and talking about natural selection. He was worried about being judged. Okay. He was a very sensitive guy. So he kind of kept it to himself. So 18 years pass and he's like sitting on this awesome theory, but he doesn't share it with anybody. So 18 years pass. Um, and what happens is a good friend of his, which his name is Alfred Wallace, calls him up on the phone and says, "Hey, Darwin, I know you're a naturalist. I'm a naturalist too. And I have this great theory about how evolution works. And let me share it with you." And so Alfred Wallace, so let me write this down. Alfred Wallace contacts Darwin and shares his new theory. Okay, I'm going to put it in quotations, new theory. Okay. And so Alfred Wallace tells Darwin all about his theory, which is the same natural selection theory that Darwin had already developed over the last like 20 years. And so Alfred shares it with Darwin. Darwin says, "Dude, I know all this. I have been thinking about this for the last 20 years. I totally agree with you. Let's share it with the world." So together, Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin, they publish a paper explaining the mechanism of natural selection. So I'm going to say together, Wallace and Darwin publish a paper explaining the mechanism of natural selection. Okay. And so now fast forward, hundreds of years, and now we are um you don't hear about Alfred Wallace. You only hear about Charles Darwin, and that's because the year after this publication, Charles Darwin writes a book and he publishes a book. And this book is huge and it's got thousands of examples of natural selection in the book. And because of all his evidence, that is why Darwin is the one who is known for coming up with natural selection, because Darwin really is the one who had been thinking about this for a long time and has all these awesome examples to show how it works. Okay, so then Darwin publishes a book, okay, and the name of the book is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So he's the first one who actually names it natural selection. And so this is the name of the book, and it's a famous book. You can get it on Amazon, and it's filled with many examples. Okay, and then so let's see, and then what happens? Okay, so that is why Darwin is the famous one, because he has the book full of examples. And so the last thing that I want to go over is there are 4 requirements for natural selection to occur. Okay, and this is what's explained in his book. Okay, so there are 4 requirements that need to be present for natural selection to occur. Okay, and what natural selection is a mechanism for evolution. Okay, so evolution can happen in other ways. Natural selection is just one way that evolution occurs. And then this is these things have to be present. These 4 requirements. Okay, so I'm going to give you a list. All right, and this is what you need to know. The first one is that a population has to have the potential to grow. Has to have the potential to grow. Okay, so a population has to have resources and space and water and mates. And so the population needs to grow. Otherwise, natural selection cannot occur. The number 2 thing is that within the population, there needs to be variation of traits. Okay, so variation of traits needs to be present. So what that means is that, for example, in the human population, everybody has different color hair. And so color of hair is a trait, and there has to be differences in that trait. And that's true for all animals and organisms. Like, for example, with the giraffes, there needed to be different heights of necks for this to happen. And so, depending on how tall the tree is, determines which giraffe is going to eat and survive and have offspring and pass on a gene with that long height. Okay. And so, even with humans, we have different heights for humans, you know? And if that height is a trait that will allow you to survive and reproduce, then it will be passed on over and over. Okay. If there is a trait that is unsuccessful, that ends up having you not survive, then that trait does not get passed down. Okay. But number 2 is that there needs to be differences in all the traits. Okay. And there are. Number 3 is that resources need to be limited so that the environment kind of produces this need for competition. Okay, so resources must be limited so that there is competition. Okay, and so what that means is that some individuals will do better than other individuals, and some individuals will live and have children, and some individuals won't live and won't have children. Okay, and then the last one is that some traits have an advantage, and those traits are more likely, have a higher probability of surviving and having offspring. Okay, so this is called a difference in fitness. Okay, and I'm sure you've heard survival of the fittest. So, what this means is that some traits have an advantage over others and gives that individual a higher probability to survive and reproduce. Okay. And the last thing is that trait has to be genetic. has to be heritable. So it has to be in a gene that can be passed on to the offspring. Okay. So, and I want to point out also that some traits are advantageous in specific environments. So, for example, with the finches in the Galapagos Islands, if you had a really skinny beak, it was only advantageous on an island that you would eat fruit. If you had this big, large beak, then that wouldn't be advantageous for the fruit. But if you had a big, large beak on the island with the seeds, you now had an advantage, versus the finches with the skinny, small beaks. So just because a trait is advantageous is is only connected to the environment that that organism lives in. And the environment is always changing. So a trait might be advantageous today, but in 100 years, that trait might not be advantageous because the environment changes. For example, we've had all these forest fires, and so a trait might be good when everything is nice and green, but now that everything is burnt down, maybe a new trait is more advantageous. Okay? Okay, guys, so that's it for today. See you next time.